This is a production of Cornell University.
How have ideas on development changed since the Second World War? The certainties of the post-war period are no longer with us anymore, and we find gaps between the goals of public policy and what is achieved by practice. In an April 2014 talk at Mann Library, economist Ravi Kanbur presents his new book, International Development: Ideas, Experience, and Prospects. This work examines how the real-life experiences of different countries and organizations have been inspired by and have in turn contributed to the ideas behind development. As Dr. Kanbur argues, by bridging the worlds of academic analysis and practical policy making in developing economies, people and organizations can achieve more successful outcomes. Ravi Kanbur is the T.H. Lee Professor of World Affairs, International Professor of Applied Economics and Management, and Professor of Economics at Cornell.
Good. Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for coming, folks. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about this book. So here's the outline of my talk. I'll introduce the book. I think I've never actually been at a book signing before, so this is my first sort of thing. Then I'll talk a little bit about two aspects of the book, which is the relationship between ideas and experience. I'll talk about the co-evolution of ideas and experience in Indian economic policy making. And secondly, I'll talk about the ideas and experience in the fast-changing landscape of development assistance or foreign aid. These are the two topics that I just want to pick up just to illustrate the general themes of the book, and then I'll conclude. So let me introduce the book. It's a book published by Oxford University Press. Now, OUP tells us that they intend this to be a major pedagogical device for development studies courses around the world. And there's a website coming in May to advance this objective. As you can see, it's a doorstopper of a book. There's 1,000 pages, almost 1,000 pages. There are 52 articles in it. It's multidisciplinary. A broad range of topics is covered, and you can have a look at the table of contents. There are 52 entries. Gender, inequality, growth, corruption, conflicts, health, water, innovation systems, China, Brazil, India. Their country experiences also. In some sense, you name it, it's here. But I'm sure somebody will say, but what I'm working on isn't there. Okay, that's always the case. Somebody always says, you see, but this thing here and this sliver of thing is not. And that's probably true. And as you'll see, I hope you'll agree, and as you'll see, the leading authors from across the disciplines, academics and practitioners as well. And there's a very generous foreword by Amartya Sen to the book, and we thank him for that. The editors, myself, David Malone, is a Canadian professor of international relations and diplomat, who is now currently president of the United Nations University and previously was Canada's ambassador to the UN and Canada's ambassador to India. Rohinton Medora, who's the president of the Center for International Global Governance, and Bruce Curry-Alder, who's the head of the Cairo office of the IDRC, the International Development Research Center. So that's the cast of characters. What's distinctive about this book? I think what's distinctive is our emphasis on the interplay between ideas and experience. Okay. Each of the authors that we invited under the topic, we asked them for their specific topic, first of all, to lay out the evolution of ideas, of key ideas in the area, and then to explore the co-evolution of ideas and experience. So it's not just saying this is what happened, or these are our prescriptions and so on. It's actually an examination of how ideas and experience co-evolved in each of those separate areas, water, health, et cetera, et cetera. And I suppose this is perhaps why OUP is so keen to link it to the teaching of development studies as a pedagogical device. And of course, they want to increase the sales of this book as well. We're not getting a penny from this, I should say. The editors are not getting a penny from this exercise. So what I want to do now is to summarize the book is impossible, and I'm not going to try. What I want to do is to take two areas in which I have myself worked and discuss with you and raise issues of the co-evolution of ideas and experience. Okay? And I want to take as I said, I want to take two topics. One is Indian economic policy making, and the second is international development assistance. So I'll speak for about 15 minutes on each. So what I want to do is to take Indian independence in 1947 as a starting point. And Indian economic policymakers at that time had certain mindsets and certain frameworks on the basis of which they evolved Indian economic policy. The question is, how did these ideas themselves evolve to become what they became in 1947? What was the path that they took over the previous 50, 100 years? And then looking forward from 1947, how did these frameworks then evolve in turn over the next 6 decades to become what they are now? And in particular, how did experience and ideas co-evolve is the type of question that I'm interested in exploring. Of course, I'm only going to be able to touch on this very briefly, but just to give you an idea, a flavor of the sort of thinking that I'm going through. Of course, in some sense, the roots of Indian economic policy go back at least as far as the Arthashastra of 300 BC of Chanakya. It's actually quite an interesting read. Even for modern day policymakers, it's an interesting read. It's a statecraft going back 2,300 years. Okay. What I want to do here, of course, is look at more immediate period, immediate pre-1947 influences on leaders and Indian economic thinkers of the Indian independence movement. Because, of course, it was these leaders and these thought leaders of the Indian independence movement who ended up being the leading Indian policymakers when India became independent in 1947. Okay? And many of their contributions are not available in standard publications. But they've left their mark on things like documents of the National Planning Committee of the Indian National Congress in the 1920s and 30s. As the struggle for independence was mounting, a group of people were thinking, what are the economic policies that we're going to put in place? And that was always related to why we're struggling for independence as well. And of course, as is always the case, the major influence on the thinking of this Indian elite, and let's face it, they were the elite, was thinking in the metropole. And it is forever thus that the elite of the periphery, the starting point for the elite of the periphery is always the ideas in the metropole. Even when they rail against those ideas, that's their starting point. Okay. And for India and Britain, this was a very interesting two-way flow of personnel. Okay? On the one hand, professors and teachers came from Britain to India to teach in the many colleges that were being set up under different auspices, educational, religious, and so on. Okay? The Indian Journal of Economics was established by a gentleman called Professor H. Stanley Jevons, who was at the Department of Economics, University of Allahabad. You will recognize is a university in India. Okay? And the first issue of the Indian Journal of Economics appeared in January 1916. H. Stanley Jevons was the son of W. Stanley Jevons, one of the 19th century founders of modern economics, of neoclassical economics. Okay? So his son was directly involved in founding the Indian Journal of Economics in 1916, just as the Indian independence movement was gathering steam in the next 20 years. John Maynard Keynes, a famous economist, his first job was in the India office. His first job out of university was as a civil servant in the India office in London, managing Indian affairs. In fact, Keynes wrote a very famous book called Indian Currency and Finance. He never went to India, but he managed Indian affairs from London. And in fact, a lot of his thinking about financial affairs and international financial flows comes from that period. Okay. Very interesting case, the last one, Austin Robinson. Again, a very famous Cambridge economist, a student of Keynes. In the 1920s, he went to be tutor to the household of the Maharaja of Gwalior in the 1920s. And you ask yourself, why is it that all these people went, all these British people went to India? Well, as always, there are missionary reasons and mercenary reasons. Okay, some of them were missionary; they wanted to go and do these things, and actually others went because actually these were rather well-paid jobs. As Austin Robinson said, this was the highest rate of pay he'd had in his entire career. And those Cornell professors who go and teach abroad in these things know what he meant. Okay? Missionary and mercenary are the two motives that combine. So there was this flow in this direction between the metropole and the periphery. But of course, the greater flow was in the other direction, from India to British universities. And this is the one that I want to focus on a little bit, because this was of more significance. And many of these students in the 1920s and 30s studied at Cambridge with Keynes. at Oxford with Keynes's former students from Cambridge. And they studied at the London School of Economics, which was founded by Sidney and Beatrice Webb to advance the intellectual and empirical foundations of Fabian socialism. This was the intellectual basis of the elite that went to study and then came back to India to lead the independence movement. And they were the ones who were drafting the documents in the National Planning Committee of the Indian National Congress as it was gearing up to make the case for independence. And these were the very people then in 1947 who ended up being the economic policymakers. So what were the influences that they came under? The Fabian socialist tradition in Britain was deeply micro-empirical in nature. Okay? It conducted the first household surveys. It was from a tradition that conducted the first household surveys looking at poverty in households in the city of York, for example, the famous Roundtree studies. Okay? Actually surveying and finding out the state of well-being of workers. And the belief, the Fabian socialist belief, was that if only you could establish these facts, if only you could show these facts to the rulers, you could change policy. If only you could show the terrible conditions under which these workers were living, you could somehow start a change in policy. And these Indian thinkers came back and started doing surveys of indigo workers, of plantation workers, and so on, in the hope that if they could somehow document these things, things could improve. And some were radicalized because they didn't, and others went in other directions. But actually so that was one strong influence of these people. But running parallel to this was also admiration for the Soviet planning model, for the top-down planning model of the 1920s and 30s, Gosplan, because it had tremendous success, as seen at that time. Fantastic growth rates, world stature to USSR, and what a contrast to high unemployment and the depression in the capitalist world at the time. These were the influences, the micro-empirical Fabian tradition and the macro top-down planning views of the success of the Soviet Union that at least I have argued influenced these thinkers. So, as I said, these were the frameworks. And so when we come to 1947, what do we get? Well, we get two things. Firstly, the National Sample Survey of India is founded. This is a glorious, glorious institution which for the last 60 years has been doing what? Has been producing household surveys every year for India. This is where all the discussions on inequality and poverty, at least on income-based inequality and poverty, draw on this data. There's 60 years of this data. And it was started by these people who came back and said, we have to have surveys which tell us the conditions of life in our country. But it would be fair to say that it's the second influence which dominated in terms of actual policy making and planning. It was the Soviet-style planning, the planning models, the planning commission, and so on. The Indian Planning Commission was set up. And the Indian Planning Commission was and still is headed by the Prime Minister of the country. There's a deputy chairman. The chairman of the Indian Planning Commission is the Prime Minister of the country, the First Minister of the country. The deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, who runs the show, is a cabinet-level minister. Okay? It shows you the effect of that framework of 1947. The first two five-year plans, 1951 to 56 and 56-61, were very Soviet in nature, top-down, inward-oriented in their framing, and so on. To use Lenin's famous phrase, they were geared towards making machines to make machines to make machines. Industrialization, and that's that. So this went on for the first 10 years, first 10, 15 years. The third five-year plan. See, there's 5-year plans. This is, every year we have a 5-year plan. Okay? Every 5 years we have a 5-year plan. And the words of the famous socialist song of the time, 5 for the years of the 5-year plan and 4 for the years it's taken. Okay, that's the And the third 5-year plan was the one which, leading from disappointments and internal debates about these things, led to an explicit focus. For the first time, it led to an explicit focus on poverty and the poor. Special attention was paid to agriculture, and so on. But in the fourth and fifth 5-year plans, the statist and inward-looking, non-internationally oriented in trade approach continued. Okay. And indeed, in the fourth 5-year plan, major national banks were nationalized. Okay. So this is the mindset. This is the framework. I now want to jump ahead to the 6th and 7th five-year plans in the 80s, going up to the 90s. This began the process of economic liberalization in India, culminating in 1991 in major external liberalization measures. So it seems as though we have a major change in mindset. We have a major change in mindset in the Indian policymakers. What explains it? It's an interesting question. What explains it? And of course, there are many explanations, and we can discuss and debate all these things, and people say it was global forces of capitalism and so on, and we can discuss all of that. But one strand of influence that I want to explore, that I do explore, is the gradual conversion of the policymakers themselves from a mindset of import substitution, which is what economists refer to in terms of talking about closed economy approaches, to outward-oriented trade promotion mindsets, which happened throughout the 1960s and 1970s among key Indian policymakers and advisors. What explains that? What explains that? Well, in my view, the East Asia example was crucial. The East Asia growth with equity miracle, so to speak, which was called the miracle, because in these countries in East Asia, you had both growth and an improvement in equity. And moreover, it was argued that this growth with equity miracle was linked to the openness in trade that these economies had. And it was contrasted with the closeness of the Indian economy, which was following all the nostrums of Soviet planning and so on, and was not delivering that much growth, and not delivering that much poverty reduction. Well, here you have a set of economies which have delivered both growth and equity in this context. And this, I think, this set of experiences in the 60s and 70s began to affect these policymakers. And of course, these were the very ones, or at least their parents were the very ones who had been to Oxford and Cambridge and LSE and had imbibed the Fabian socialist framework and the Soviet planning framework. So Manmohan Singh, who's now prime minister, and was finance minister during that key period, okay, was an undergraduate at Cambridge in the 1950s. But he did his PhD in Oxford in the 1960s. And the title of his thesis was India's Export Performance, 1951 to 60, Export Prospects and Policy Implications. It's no accident, it seems to me, that the man who was finance minister at the crucial time of external liberalization in India did his PhD questioning the very nostrums which he himself had supported in the 1950s. And I believe that the East Asia example was crucial in turning the thinking of this group of people. And there were many other examples like Jagdish Bhagwati and Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Well, I want to stop here in 1991 because we can go on, and this cycle goes on to more market-oriented, less market-oriented, and so on. But and these battles are being fought as we speak. The Indian elections are going on right now. But I don't want to talk about that because, in fact, these issues will be taken up in a panel on May 7th when Ron Herring, Prabhu Pingali, and myself will be on a panel discussing India after the elections. Okay? So the story after 1991 may be taken up in that thing. But I want to get across to you is the interrelationships between the evolution of ideas and the evolution of facts on the ground and how they played out in this context. So my second example that I want to take, which in some sense very different, although you'll see India again plays a key role, a very different type of topic, which is the changing landscape of development assistance. Let me start by saying the following. There are official definitions of what is meant by a low-income country. It's per capita income below a certain level. There are official definitions of what's meant by a middle-income country. Your income is above that level. Roughly $1,000 per capita is the cutoff. There are official definitions of individual poverty, what it means for an individual to be below a certain minimum consumption level. When you put all these official definitions together, consider the following two facts. 25 years ago, 90% of the world's poor lived in low-income countries. Today, only 25% of the world's poor live in countries that are classified as low-income. 75% of them live in countries that are classified as middle-income countries. Okay? So let me say it again. 25 years ago, and indeed 50 years ago, 90% of the world's poor lived in countries that were classified as low-income countries. In other words, the countries were themselves poor. Today, only 25% of the world's poor live in countries that are classified as low-income. 75% of the world's poor live in countries that are classified as middle-income countries. In other words, it's basically fast growth of countries like China and India, which has taken them above the low-income threshold into the middle-income category, but also actually lots of other countries like Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Nigeria, Ghana, et cetera, I could go on. Okay? What that's doing, what that has done in the last 25 years, and the facts on the ground are changing, it has dissolved the connection between an individual being poor and his country being poor. 50 years ago, 25 years ago, if an individual was poor, according to official definitions, you could be pretty damn sure that the country in which that individual lived was also a low-income country. But that tight connection is no longer tight. It's quite loose. And this breakdown, this movement of facts on the ground is now putting significant strain on an international aid architecture which was designed for the realities of 50 years ago. And it was designed 50 years ago for the realities of 50 years ago. And that was a world in which the link between individual poverty and national poverty was a tight link. No more. So, what were the features of this international aid architecture of 50 years ago? Most aid agencies have a rule or a policy which sharply tapers aid to a country as it crosses from LIC to MIC status, from low income to middle income status. Quite understandable in the realities of 50 years ago, because there's this tight connection between poverty and the crossing this thing over. This, for example, is true for the biggest of such pot of funds, namely the World Bank soft loan window, known by its acronym IDA. IDA. IDA stands for International Development Association, IDA. Just think of it as being a big pot of aid funds. It's the biggest pot of aid funds. That's why I mention it. But basically, every pot of aid funds has, roughly speaking, this character. The rules vary a little bit from place to place, etc. But basically, when you cross from low income to middle income, aid is cut off. India, for example, I come back to India, has now crossed this threshold. It's known as graduation. Okay? When you cross this thing, you graduate. And so India has now crossed IDA, this biggest aid pot, its graduation threshold. And in fact, India has crossed the threshold for any other agencies cutoff as well, because most of the thresholds are this LIC-MIC cutoff. And yet, India is a country with 400 million poor people. So I ask you, does it make sense to withdraw aid from a country which has 400 million poor people just because it has crossed an average threshold where its per capita income is now no longer a low-income country, it's a middle-income country? Those are the rules of 50 years ago, which are now facing the reality of today. And the question really is, how can IDA, this global fund which was created to engage with the world's poor, disengage from 400 million of them in India, which is actually 1/3 of the global poor, just because the country's average income has crossed this graduation threshold? So that's one view. Well, here are some other views, which I find when I go out on the road arguing for this case, that aid should continue to these countries which have a lot of poor people, even though they've now crossed the official threshold. Well, here are some perspectives that I get in town halls, amongst bureaucrats and governments and so on in northern capitals. Well, India is now a MIC. We set these rules up. There's a connection between a country being poor and an individual being poor. Let's apply the rules now, okay? Second, on the ground, people say, hold on a second, India's business leaders are buying up our factories in the north. Why should we be helping their poor? We're worried about our jobs now being taken up by factories jobs going out abroad. And horror of horrors, India and all these other countries, China, etc., has its own aid program. In fact, India has an aid program of $5 billion to Africa. You see, 50 years ago, the question would never have arisen. But here's a question that now arises. You have a country which has 400 million poor people. Its businesses are buying up factories in the north. And moreover, India is giving aid to even poorer countries in Africa. Does that absolve northern countries of the moral responsibility to give aid to India? This is a new question because the reality on the ground is new and it wasn't there 50 years ago. Now it turns out that this shift, this debate, is actually related in a very interesting way to the world of ideas. In particular, they're mirrored in a very interesting and important debate in political philosophy. And that's what I want to now talk about in the next few minutes. And it's a debate between the philosopher Rawls, John Rawls, and those who thought they were his followers and called themselves, or we might call them, the global Rawlsians. Let me explain what I mean. Here's Rawls's position, which I'll just review very briefly. Okay? Starting from a sort of a Hobbesian basis of a contract between sovereign and subjects, a ruler and ruled, if you like, Rawls argued, Rawls's centerpiece analysis in the theory of justice, was that this contract between sovereign and subject should have certain features. And he viewed it as his task to delineate what those features should be from the perspective of political philosophy, moral philosophy. And among these, there are many, among these, is that a policy should be conducted so as to benefit the least well-off. He said that would be a feature of a morally appropriate contract between sovereign and subject. This is the so-called Rawlsian maximin, maximize the minimum, maxi-min. Okay? That was Rawls's grand conclusion. And the rationale for this, again, in 3 lines I'm summarizing Rawls's 1,000-page book. But the rationale for this is what Rawls called the veil of ignorance. He said what is appropriate for us to do is not to think of ourselves knowing what we know, not to think of our position knowing what we know about ourselves, but to put ourselves behind the veil of ignorance. That we will not know what the outcome is going to be, and now you choose what policy you want. And Rawls said, behind the veil of ignorance, we will all choose the policy that will maximize the minimum. Why? Because none of us knows if we will turn out to be that poorest person. If I want to use this in biblical terms, there but for the grace of God go I. Okay? So that's the core of the Rawlsian argument, saying that policy in this moral philosophical sense should be targeted towards making the poorest better off. Well, Rawls's followers, global Rawlsians as they call themselves, applied this to the global context. Great, yeah? So we have global context, we have a global veil of ignorance, we have a global this, etc. Conclusion, global policy, in particular global development assistance, should be targeted towards the poorest no matter where they are. And you apply that logic, yeah, sure, because India has 400 million poor people, we still have a moral responsibility to that. The fact that India, on average, has crossed, the nation state has crossed, is neither here nor there from the global Rawlsian perspective. So they're applying Rawls's thinking, the contractarian theories of justice, the veil of ignorance argument, etc., and saying, yeah, global Rawlsianism means we should focus on the poorest of the world, no matter where they are. And that would argue strongly for continuing assistance, even though the country has crossed the threshold, if there's a single poor person in that country. But interestingly, and this is what happens in the world of ideas, the major critic of global Rawlsianism was Rawls himself. This they didn't expect, I suppose, okay? Why was it? Why did Rawls criticize his own followers who were using what they thought was his argument? He said, you're not really using my argument. What did he mean by that? He said, you see, my argument, the Rawlsian argument, flows from a contractarian theory of justice. It flows from Hobbes having a contract between subject and sovereign and subject, etc., etc. Once you have a contract, once you have the basis of a contract, then we can discuss what the contours of that contract should be. But if there's no basis for the contract, how can you discuss what the contract should be like? And his argument was that in the context of the nation state, however imperfectly, we have that basis for that contract between sovereign and subject. Show me what the basis is in the global context, was Rawls's argument. Rawls's famous book was called A Theory of Justice, which everybody knows about. But Rawls's less famous book, which fewer people know about, was called The Law of Peoples, in which he made this counter-argument against the global Rawlsians. Okay? So, essentially the argument is that the nation-state has a very particular feature. It establishes the contract between sovereign and subject, and that's why the Rawlsian argument flows. So you cannot simply translate it. He says, yeah, you can use whatever argument you want, but you can't use my argument to do this. And then, of course, the global Rawlsians turned themselves into common humanitarians and so on and so forth. They went into a different direction. What's interesting to me, of course, this debate goes on, refined positions, etc. And my colleague and friend at Cornell, Richard Miller, professor of philosophy, is one of the ones who's in the forefront in this type of discussion. But what I want you to note is the following. Note how the philosoph. Oh gosh, what have I done here? This is telling me something. But note, I want you to note how the philosophical debates that I've talked about actually parallel the ground level debates that I face when I go and talk about continuing aid to India. Okay? Basically, the notion that there's something special about a nation state crossing the poverty threshold on average, that somehow that reduces our moral responsibility to the poor people in that state. That's the political nature of that's the argument I face in the political context. And of course, it's not exact parallel, but it's interesting how that relates to the debate between Rawls and global Rawlsians in high-level moral philosophy. The second point I'd like you to recognize is that this issue did not surface 50 years ago. These questions were not there 50 years ago. Because the connection between you being poor and your country being poor was tight. But now it matters. It matters now that the connection is loose. Now that the connection is loose. So the point is that this debate on ideas has become particularly salient because the development facts on the ground have shifted. So let me conclude. What I'm doing here is introducing a new book which explores interaction between ideas and experience in international development. In lots and lots of different topics. As I said, take any particular sector, health, education, water, agriculture, and so on. We ask the authors to do a sort of exercise that I've just done for you. Trace the evolution of ideas and explain how those ideas evolved, in particular the co-evolution of ideas and facts, ideas and experience, and so on. What I've done is to give you two illustrations of this. Firstly, the evolution of ideas on Indian economic policy making, where they came from, and how they evolved as the situation on the ground changed and evolved itself. And secondly, I've given you an illustration from the evolution of debates on foreign aid and the nature of global moral responsibility to the poor, and how, because the facts have changed, the ideas are now responding, and the debates are now responding to that debate. So please delve into the book at your leisure. Thank you very much.
This has been a production of Cornell University. On the web at cornell.edu.